Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon to the Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, any other entity with which our guests might be affiliated. So for today's episode, we have a special sort of crossing the streams event going on here where those who followed us in the past, you know that we have, with Dr. Yuval Weber here, our Russia SME at the Krulak Center, we've been focusing on the war in Ukraine and Russian-related things here for over a year now. But since we got Mr. Dan Rice on board here as our China subject matter expert, we've also, taken the chance to have him on several times now on the Brewcast series to look at, emerging trends and concerns in terms of what China is doing, not just in the South China Sea, but in other parts of the world. And now we're crossing the streams. So hoping for a good, energetic discussion here, and very happy to finally bring these two gentlemen who we've had on multiple times in the past to pool their knowledge, share the wealth, and get into both what's going on in Ukraine, but also some broader implications. So I think I've sufficiently introduced our guest here. So the thing we're going to be focusing on is last week there was a much hyped summit between Chairman of the Communist Party in China, Xi Jinping, who went to visit his, I forget what they call it, but his friend without limits, President Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation, was there for a state visit for several days. And what many people sort of outside were looking at is, what, if anything, will this mean for Russia's continued ability to prosecute the war in Ukraine? Because we know from sort of the U.S. intelligence side, as well as other analysts looking at this conflict, big question is going to be, if China decided to provide significant material support, that could possibly act as a balance or an offset to the very significant material support that Western countries in the United States have been providing to Ukraine for them to stay in the fight. And something that, Dr. Weber has talked about here is, some of the two key things Ukraine, needs to ultimately push Russia back over the border is, the willpower to fight, but Western support. And right now, the Western support has certainly not been mirrored in any significant way by Chinese support to Russia. But the question is, will that change? And this was sort of a big point that we were looking at in this particular summit to see if there were going to be any specific signs to manifest or indicate some sort of change on the side of China to Russia in terms of increasing that level of material support, because the Chinese commercial industrial output could be significant if they wanted to apply that to sending new weapons, new vehicles, et cetera, to Russia. So we're going to see kind of what happened, what the outputs of that were, and what both sides walked away from the table with, or maybe, what do they think they walked away from the table with compared to what they actually got. So Dan, Yuval, welcome back to this Brewcast Rabbit Hole crossover event. And I think we said, Yuval, we're going to start with you looking at, from the Russian side, what were they hoping, obviously rolling out the welcome wagon here, what were they hoping that China would commit to? What is Russia? What did they sort of publicly say that they think they got? And what do we think they actually got?
So certainly. So excellent that we can have crossover episodes. So hello again, Major Brown. Hello, Dan. I'll go by Yuval. Even before we get to the actual summit, the real scene setter requires that right before the summit happened, the weekend the few days beforehand, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and the basically the apparatchik who is in charge of kidnapping all the children from Ukraine. This is obviously, in a certain sense, a real, not exactly humiliation, but deep irritation. And the Russians took deep offense to this, that their leader would be subject to an arrest warrant, as if he's some, minor Serbian / Yugoslavian or sub-Saharan African leader. Leaders of great powers simply don't have things like this happen to them. So they really took it very seriously in terms of how upset they are. But of course, like within the media, they played it off. They said this is just another way for the West to get at this. But it's been clear over the past week of reporting that this was something that Putin was insulted by. And certainly when thinking about, the image they wanted to project for Xi's visit, they wanted to project something of, everything is fine. Don't worry about this. We are basically your partner, to China. We're your partner forever and ever. No limits, nothing of that kind. And so what they got is immediately an entire weekend of, people around the world, looking at Putin's schedule, seeing that he's supposed to go to South Africa later this summer for like a BRICS summit. And now the question is, will that summit happen? Will he go and challenge the South Africans to arrest him? Whatever the BRICS summit was supposed to represent. And this goes into what the Russians wanted out of the Chinese. The Russians at their core wanted to project an image of stability, an image of sort of endurance and resilience to the Western-led order. And they wanted basically this summit to be yet another brick in the wall when it comes to building multipolarity. So an arrest warrant, it just is a humiliating deviation from that. So that's the context. And obviously then, Xi obviously didn't cancel the trip because of this. So he still went. And, the historian Sergei Radchenko said there's a Chinese proverb, like many others, that, I don't know if it's true or not because I don't speak Chinese, but he said, loud thunder, but few raindrops. And so effectively what the Russians were looking for is lots of agreements, lots of, signatures on the dotted line. And they didn't get very much of that. So the Western perspective from this, so what the Russians and the Chinese agreed, at least in principle, and by agreeing, I mean, what did the Russians agree to do and the Chinese accepted without reciprocating? Russia said that they would use the Yuan as their currency of international settlement with not just China, but other countries around the world. So essentially accelerating de-dollarization, particularly in Middle East, Africa. The Chinese didn't say that they would use rubles. So we can start with that. But really in terms of what the Russians were also looking to do, Putin said that he'd be open to creating a new pipeline from Russia into China. Xi demurred, and I'll let Dan give the reasons why. But ostensibly, now that Putin has no leverage in Europe because he's out of Europe as a dominant gas supplier, probably Xi Jinping is waiting for the price to go down even further, even if they sell it at cost, something of that line. We also know that Russia said that they were open to Chinese investment into the Far East and into the Arctic. This is huge because this is something the Russians have guarded jealously for the past roughly 200 years. Keeping China out of the Far East, out of Siberia, has been something that has been in effect since the Russians conquered these areas, really going back into history several hundred years. And so in that regard, the Western perspective on all of this is that Russia, Putin, is basically mortgaging Russia's future to China in the hopes that China will provide something that will allow Putin to prosecute the war better. So again, unclear. Putin certainly acknowledged and appreciated the 12-point plan, which I think is more to be discussed by Dan in just a minute. But in that regard, what we see here from the Western perspective is there is no doubt as to who's the stronger partner. And now it's becoming more obvious and can't be basically hidden or explained away. But valiantly, the sinologists of Russia are attempting to. In effect, what the sinologists of Russia are saying is that, all these small things that I just mentioned could happen, could not happen. But the most important thing that happened is that Xi Jinping came to Moscow, stayed for a while, and during his time there, he endorsed President Putin generally. He endorsed him for his next run for president and continued to pledge that China would support Russia. So even if the experts, the analysts of Russia are saying may say that, the special military operation may be taking longer than is necessary, that the special military operation is nevertheless giving Russia and China the opportunity to articulate a world with each other and without the United States and the broader West. And that Xi's visit was very critical to that. And so the Russian sinologists are very happy with this summit, at least in public, because it demonstrated multipolarity is here. Because Russia matters, China matters, and they matter even more together amongst themselves. So that's essentially the big takeaways. Not too much in terms of plans. The Chinese certainly didn't give anything that the Russians were looking for. The Western view of this is that, Russia's losing big and they're losing fast to the Chinese in terms of what the rest of the 21st century looks like. And but from the perspective of Moscow, this is pretty good because multipolarity is far more important than any one particular summit. And I think that's a good place for me to pause and to hand it over.
Great, thank you, Yuval. So Dan, we'll turn it over to you. So kind of looking from, the other person sitting at the chair there in that summit, Chairman Xi Jinping. What are your thoughts on what did he come to Moscow to accomplish? What did he and or Chinese media seem to think that he accomplished? And then in between in the scenes there, what do you think actually happened? And what do you think we'll sort of see over the next several months?
Sure, absolutely. And Yuval, it's great to be on a broadcast with you. It was really interesting hearing Yuval's take on everything because obviously I focused mainly on the Chinese side of the house. And to hear some of the things that I had picked up echoed in the Russian perspective is very, very interesting. So to do the context again for the Chinese side, in my opinion, it's more of a push for recognition on the international stage, this summit, specifically with Xi Jinping coming into his third term in office, which is a big deal in at least domestic politics. It was unprecedented, and he was recently reelected, as they call it, to the presidency, right? So that gives him all the levers of power within the within the domestic institutions to make him more or less like a Mao Zedong kind of figure, holding the presidency, the general secretary position, and the chairman of the Central Military Commission for 3 terms. So Chinese perspectives on why this meeting was important, central on the idea that you've all brought up of multipolarity, right? China has been pushing for a multipolar world order for quite some time now. I would say in earnest for the last 15 years. So essentially once Xi Jinping took the stage in China, and him going into a third term, giving another 5 years of consistent leadership and pushing the same message is a very, very strong message in the international community. Russia obviously plays a critical role in that, as you've all had mentioned. And actually, there was a great quote from Xi Jinping to Putin at the very end of the meetings, which goes along the lines of change is coming that hasn't happened in 100 years. And we, being Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, are driving this change together, right? So it's the idea that in essentially the last 100 years, a little bit less, the world order has been more or less dominated by the West, specifically the United States leading a Western coalition, building international institutions, promoting ideas like democracy, freedom of speech, human rights, etc. And for China, that has benefited in certain ways, but in other ways, it's actually worked to constrain some of the things that China wants to get after. Specifically here is the idea that Western democracy is the only, in the Chinese view, is seen as the only right way to modernize and develop your own nation. They're obviously pushing for a different message, not that it is one inherently that's spreading ideology, but rather trying to demonstrate like, hey, there's other ways to get after this. And Russia, well, I can't speak too much to the internal politics. I know Yuval, maybe you'll hit on this, but it's not exactly a cookie cutter Western style democracy. it looks a little bit different. And so for China, Russia works as another way to show, hey, you can be a great power and work in this multipolar world order that they're pushing for, and not have to look like the United States, right? So from this meeting, some more backdrop here was China did put out a few weeks ago their 12-point peace plan for the Russia-Ukraine war. And it looked a lot like freezing the battle lines where they are. It looked like China was claiming that they support sovereignty over the different territories and that each nation should have its own sovereignty in absolute terms. But realistically, within the 12-point peace plan that they proposed, it looked more like giving or setting the stage for Russia's annexation or legitimate annexation of the different territories in Ukraine that they've already taken over. So long story short on that is that it got a little bit of traction and certainly was surprising, right? People didn't really expect China to show up as a mediator in such a large conflict, specifically one that pits NATO allies against Russia. But they did. And we even saw Zelensky had taken some interest in the plan, probably because it was the only thing proposed at the time for a ceasefire. But he mentioned he wanted to meet with Xi Jinping, or at least Wang Yi. And then clearly with the Xi-Putin summit, there was a push for buy-in from the Russian side. There were about 6 hours of secret talks that Putin and Xi held. We speculate, the community speculates that those 6 hours were likely spent discussing the specific peace plan and trying to get more buy-in for it from the Russian side. That being said, I don't think there was too much. And I don't know, and maybe Yuval, you can talk to this on Putin's perspective on this peace plan. But at least from what I was able to glean, it seems like it was a step in the right direction, a step towards something that they could maybe work together on, meaning Russia and China, to try to get talks going. But it wasn't quite everything that Russia wanted. And it looked a lot more like just freezing lines and creating demilitarized zones than actually giving Russia the victory that it needs. So that was, first and foremost, getting more credibility for Xi Jinping at home, showing that he's able to be a great leader, go internationally, speak with other future or current global powers in a way that looks like promoting his vision of the multipolar world order. That was a big win. Pushing for that peace plan was a big win. And then I think one of the key things is the idea of trade in the Yuan. That was actually a gigantic win. And I don't know how much it's really being talked about in communities, but China and Russia collectively have been pushing for changing the reserve currency in different countries for a while now. At one point, they had proposed some sort of like new gold standard. That fell flat on its face. But creating more transactions, and now I think Putin said 65% of trade volume is now settled in local currencies, the yuan. But that's a huge deal, because one of the things that China is most afraid of, in my perspective, in the event of any sort of conflict, no matter where it is that China is involved with, is the idea of sanctions and being able to lock China's economy out of the international economy. And one of the primary ways to do that is to freeze transactions or cross-border transactions through the SWIFT system, which is rooted in the dollar. So if there are other ways to avoid those sanctions and the loss of the economic development component to China's domestic affairs, then that's always a win for China. So this summit, bringing out that was a big win. In terms of the future of the Russia-Ukraine war, just to touch on that briefly, yes, China has been buying oil and gas from Russia. No, it doesn't look like Xi Jinping is going to push for more pipelines, but there's already a few that are in the works. So they'll continue to buy that kind of energy resources out of Russia. They've sent, I think it's $11 million worth of drones to Russia. Just read a report earlier that they're sending other things that can be used in the war, things like fibers for protective equipment, so like bulletproof plates, sending fibers to Russia to build those. So there are other ways that China has been supporting this effort, and will likely continue to do so in the near future.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Yuval, for sort of setting the table here. We got a good number of questions here already in the chat, so I do want to get to go to those. But Yuval, is there anything you wanted to add on top of that before we go into the questions here?
Whatever concessions, really whatever concessions the Russians are making to the Chinese now, it's all being subsumed under the rhetoric of multipolarity is here, and sort of this is just us establishing the rules of the road. So we may see this as step downs for the Russians. They're simply moving into a different reality. The other thing about the peace plan that Dan had mentioned is that the key sort of objection here, a lot of it is like fine that no one would sort of dispute on any side, but ultimately the thing that the peace plan calls for is for ceasing hostilities and going to peace talks. That's obviously the non-starter for the Ukrainians, because they believe that one, their position is they want to reconquer all of their own territory. Like that's their objective. Militarily, politically, their objective is, the ingathering of our lands so that we can basically militarize and protect ourselves against Russia well into the future. We don't want to be, fighting over, this bit of Luhansk and that bit of Donetsk and this approach to Crimea for, the next 1,000 years. So, and because Russia's current offensive is not going all that well, it's certainly like moving the lines a bit, but nothing dramatic. The Ukrainians still haven't started their counteroffensive. So the Ukrainians are certainly thinking, we have tanks and fighter jets coming in. We certainly don't yet know what the battlefield will look like in 3 months, much less 6 months. So in that regard, the peace plan welcomed by the Russians, but not by the Ukrainians. And certainly because Russia is the, partner of China, it would behoove China to actually get Russia to stop doing things. That essentially would make the difference in the conduct of the war. And just like one quick thing before we go to like the questions, the canonical example of this is the United States in between the UK and Argentina in 1982 over the Falklands War. The United States had obviously a special relationship with the UK, but also was very close to the Argentinian, military junta at that time. And the Americans, we got very clear intelligence, we got very clear briefings that the British were serious about retaking the Falkland Islands, the Las Malvinas, from the Argentinians who had taken it. The Argentinians first didn't think the British were serious, but two, once the US side was really trying to tell them the British are coming, the Argentinian response was, of course you'd say that. You're their friend and partner, so obviously you're trying to get us to do something which is against our interest. And that, is essentially what if the US had said something to the British, like you need to respect Argentinian sovereignty, that would have been different. In the late 1990s, when the NATO was very serious about bombing Milosevic and Serbia, Yugoslavia, all that, Milosevic only basically stopped his campaign once the Russians told him the Americans are serious. Because Milosevic could look at, Yevgeny Primakov, Boris Yeltsin, and recognize these people don't like the Americans, but if they're believing the Americans, that means I'm not getting support. And so that's essentially how the third parties could actually shape the conduct of this war.
All right, great. Thank you, Yuval. Okay, so with that, I do want to start getting into the questions here to make sure we get through as many as we can. So the first one we got here actually touches, and it's to both of you, touches on sort of immediate aftermath, something neither one of you hit about here, but it came just a few days after. So I think Xi was barely left his plane had taken off from Moscow when Russia announced that it was, and this is somewhat unclear, but it was looking at potentially deploying tactical or low yield nuclear weapons to Belarus with some attendant training of training and stationing of aircraft delivery vehicles over there, what have you, to make it happen. So this is I was reading today some stuff that both Moscow and Belarus are saying no, this does not violate the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So we can potentially get into both of your gentlemen's take on that particular issue there. But to both of you, what is this? What did that action immediately after the summit? What did that say? To whether maybe expectations on Russia's side for backing they will get from China, and then conversely to China, has there been any response in terms of they just went there to do this big multipolar, we're offering this peace plan in good faith to be a fair neutral arbiter, right? And then your partner says, yeah, we're gonna start shifting nukes over, and because Beijing is specifically called for not ratcheting up nuclear saber rattling. So for that particular announcement, what are your takes on that?
So this little mini episode could go directly into a textbook of Putin's negotiating tactics. This is something that we've seen a zillion times, and viewers or listeners of the rabbit hole will probably roll their eyes because they've heard me say this about a million times at this point. The special military operation is not going well. There are very few ways that Putin can re-enter the international headlines from a position of strength. Nuclear weapons is the only way at this point to do so in a consistent fashion. And so basically once Putin and the people around him were looking at all the headlines of, China got, Russia got dunked on, in this Xi Putin summit, how else to reframe the conversation except to say, the Belarusians are feeling the pressure from NATO, therefore we're going to, put nuclear missiles there. And the second part of it, which is classic Putin, is not to say I'm doing this because F you, I'm doing this because NATO's already doing it. NATO's been doing this for decades. Therefore, because NATO and the United States is a great power and so is Russia, I'm not doing anything escalatory. I'm not doing anything inflammatory. I'm merely adhering to the established norms set by my Western partners. And so so that there are U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe is basically the precedent that he's referring to. So the quibble here obviously is that those are U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. And what the Russians are saying is that they're going to put Russian nuclear warheads on Belarusian missiles. Also, Russia already has nuclear weapons of sufficient range in Western Russia itself. So this is not going to, get the missiles to Poland maybe 30 seconds faster. So it's really not much in terms of what's going on in terms of like the nuclear balance of forces, but it does basically remind the world and the Western world writ large that Russia does have the nuclear saber to rattle. Now, obviously, this means that Belarus has much, even relative to last week, less sovereignty than before, should this actually happen. We don't know if it's going to happen. We do know that when Putin was talking about nuclear weapons in relation to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, whether he would bomb that, whether he would sort of like use tactical nuclear weapons in that region, we know that President Biden, President Macron of France, and Josep Borrell, who is the foreign policy chief of the European Commission, within roughly speaking a day and within basically 12 hours of each other, all said, if Russia uses nuclear weapons, the response will be devastating and it'll be conventional. What we observed thereafter is that much of Russia's Black Sea fleet then moved away from Ukraine. Because what they could recognize is the use of nuclear weapons is a specific red line that President Biden laid out that he was not going to permit under any circumstances, without response or retribution, and that any usage of nuclear weapons is going to mean the destruction of Russian armies in the field or Russian ships in the Black Sea. That's why a lot of hither and thither, it may happen, but it doesn't really change the balance of forces in theater, and it doesn't change the conduct of this particular war, because should they be used, the response will be devastating. And certainly if and when, Lukashenko starts to waver from power, the next government is going to request the removal of these nuclear weapons.
Right. Thanks, Yuval. So Dan, from China's side, what was their sort of reaction to this immediately following the, big high publicity, we're here to help. We're here to be, good faith, even-handed negotiator from the summit.
It seems like China's reaction was simply, don't rattle that saber. And likely it's because China right now is on its own path to developing, or at least building, more nuclear warheads. They've got a plan for, I think it's 1,500 warheads by 2030. And notably, they're not bound by too many different international agreements on how to limit that growth, right? So from my perspective, the reason that China would kind of not necessarily freak out, but say like, hey, temper your attitude on this, is because they're trying to get after that problem set on their own front without bringing the attention too much to what their efforts are. So just more broadly speaking here too, nuclear weapons right now, I've heard it described as a way to enable local conflict and non-nuclear, right? Conventional local conflict. If you have a nuclear deterrent, then you're able to prosecute a conventional war without necessarily the threat of escalating to nuclear war because of the devastation that that would cause. And for China, that's very, very important when you're looking at something like a potential contingency over Taiwan. In my opinion, there is almost zero reason that China would ever use a nuclear weapon in a conflict over Taiwan unless something substantial happened to them first. They still have their no first use policy. That being said, their nuclear doctrine is a little bit different in that no first use doesn't necessarily directly translate to our understanding of no first use, right? There are some contingencies in which they might consider using them, but those are pretty dramatic situations. So for Putin to be out there saying like, hey, nuclear weapons, even ones at the tactical level, are always on the table to be used in this kind of conflict, China's sitting back and saying, well, wait a second, we have our own development plan. We want to modernize our nuclear weapons, build our stockpiles up, and kind of keep that on the down low as much as possible, especially when we look internally in the US, we're really focused on modernizing our own nuclear systems across the triad, and really, shoring that capability up. There's as many people refer to it, the strategic window of opportunity before the US and China at least is there, but it's for the Chinese to make efforts. And this is one of those efforts that they want to pursue. So they want to keep it all quiet. Putin's bringing it to the forefront of discussion, and it's not a good look from the Chinese perspective, at least.
All right, great. Thank you. And so Dan, next question is kind of teed up for you, so we'll just keep you on the mic here. And this actually goes back to what you've all sort of touched on at the very beginning, which was the ICC arrest warrant issued out against Putin and his partner in kidnapping there. So has this gotten any attention or played out at all in terms of sort of official Chinese media channels discussing it, whether it, my take, well, I would assume if they're discussing it, they're saying it's not justified, but has there been any sort of public reaction from those media channels? And is there any indication that behind closed doors, perhaps Chinese leadership has any concerns perhaps about the implications for the fact that their friend without limits has basically got a warrant on them?
I have not personally seen too much in Chinese media on this. Maybe it's for lack of, going and scouring the internet for it. But I would imagine that the Chinese media would spin it in such a way that it's like, hey, this is unfair. I know for the Russia-Ukraine war writ large, the Chinese media has been really back and forth over time, periods in which China supports Russia in the media, and then periods in which China supports Ukraine, and it was constantly flip-flopping. I think that's settled down to a regular drumbeat of, this is occurring and national sovereignty for both sides is important, etc. And that manifests itself in that 12-point peace plan. But something like this arrest warrant from the ICC under the context of not having a solidified voice on which side is at fault does fall into this category of like, well, if Russia is not actually at fault for this invasion, then how can this ever be a legitimate arrest warrant, right? More broadly speaking, for leadership, I don't think it's all that much of a concern. Keep in mind, when the West was putting sanctions on Russia, China stepped up to the plate and was like, hey, we're willing to continue to do business with Russia regardless of these sanctions, even if it means, some sort of clandestine swapping of flags on ships for oil somewhere. They've done that consistently, and specifically with Iran, right? Same thing happens with North Korea when they're doing trade with them. So I don't think it's all that big of a deal. It does, for at least for Xi Jinping's where he stands, it does mean that Russia looks slightly more desperate in where it can find friendship and partners. So it gives Xi Jinping a few more bargaining chips when he does go to these tables and talks with Putin and tries to hammer out any sort of agreements. And maybe, I'm not sold on this, but maybe it's one of the reasons why the Yuan became the trading currency. And then, as you've all mentioned, there's not too much talk of the rubles being used. So that could be one of the ways that's manifested itself. But largely, I do think that it will give some impetus to China and Russia to try to figure out ways to either influence international institutions more than what they're already doing, but to try and set the stage or set the factors, as they'd call it, for not having these kinds of things occur in the future as the world does make that shift to multipolarity with these great powers. Because at the end of the day, if Putin is at risk of being charged by an international institution, I'm sure Xi Jinping sitting back at home thinking, everybody's been harping on the Uyghur issue. When is that going to cross the line? And, maybe there could be some sort of thing out for Xi Jinping in the future. And that would look incredibly bad for both the domestic and the international audience.
Yeah, indeed. Although I sort of personally wonder, maybe not wonder is the right word, but I sort of feel like Xi might have a little bit more sense in sort of how he talks about these things publicly, because
Yes.
the thing that was striking for the warrant issued for, Putin and his, I forget what her official title is, but basically it came out very rapidly after some released video where Putin and his compatriot, like, she basically admitted on camera, like, I took a child from Mariupol, right? And we've had it's been tough getting to know each other, but now we got to know. It's like, she's essentially confessing on camera. So that makes it fairly easy to, put a warrant out. Whereas I think Xi is probably a lot more circumspect
It's not only that, but if that came out of the official channels or an official making that statement, the way that China controls its media, that kind of video would probably only hit the censorship bureau and then nowhere else beyond that. And then they would obviously take some drastic measures at home and then paint it up very nicely for the international landscape. Yeah.
So I was just looking this up. So her name, I was looking at what is her official title. Her name is Maria Levova Bielova. She is the presidential commissioner for children's rights in Russia since 2021. She clearly loves children because she has 5 biological children and 18 adopted children, including the latest one from last month that she took from Mariupol. So Putin found the person who really loves children and doesn't have any personal boundaries. And I think that's like a good person for a mass kidnapping program. And I think one other thing that I wanted to sort of just like echo from Dan's comments, when Dan described the Russians seem a bit desperate for international friendship, that to me sort of is a point worth going into a bit further, because one, clearly the Russians are very thirsty. They need sort of like others to acknowledge their status as such. And really what the ICC thing does is it basically takes away Russia's ability to speak directly to the global South, except from a position of we've been offended by the West too, which is a lot different from basically what was Russia's rhetoric before this, which was we're the only ones who can speak for the global South. If that shifts into we are among the global south, that's inconsistent with their great power status. And because people across the global south look at the International Criminal Court as only going after relatively weak countries, relatively like, authoritarian leaders, but not from great powers, that's essentially a source of a source of rhetoric that Russia is no longer able to, I guess, practice or wield very well anymore.
Yeah, if I could just tease that thread out one more second. Very interesting that you mentioned it would put Russia as part of the global south, because I published something recently on China's take on the global south and their vision as the leader for the global south, right? So if Russia is lumped in as part of the global south, then it fundamentally would mean that China's leading them in their own perspective of what that all means, right? So yeah, that is an interesting take. It also is worth noting, just for the audience, the ICC charges, right? I believe only a few countries have actually said that they would enforce them, and it would require Putin to travel to a country with extradition laws that make him actually go to the ICC and face the charges, right? So
sure. So I mean, this could be sort of the decline of like one specific international norm, but then again, like the United States, North China is also signatory to the ICC.
right.
So the practical effect is there's very little chance outside of, maybe some like fever dreams in Northern Virginia that Putin is going to see the inside of a courtroom in The Hague.
Right.
Literally at best, if there is some sort of messy, like not the death of Stalin, but like the abduction of Putin type movie, what I would imagine happening in some sort of leadership struggle is that everything bad that Russia's ever done for the past 25 years will be blamed on Putin, and he'll be brought up on charges in domestic courts. And basically his trial / imprisonment will basically be a chip in order to like get Western sanctions relief, something like that. So again, practical effect of this is limited, but it does have these status concerns, these status hits that
Yeah.
Russia certainly didn't want to take.
Yeah, it's a lot of optics, and fundamentally what a geopolitical struggle is a struggle of narratives, right? So if it's influencing that narrative, then yes, it is negative for them.
Yeah, great. And Yuval there, I think you kind of touched on one of the other questions we had in the chat here, which is, what might happen if Putin goes sent packing to the ICC. It's probably it'd be far too much to think that somehow that he's gonna be spirited away by some team from some third party country. But I imagine that at the very minimum, it's gonna shape his future travel plans, because a non-zero chance is still a chance, and how much you want to roll the dice on that. And yeah, so China and the U.S., they're not signatories to it necessarily, but a lot of other countries are, and I'm just sort of speculating, but maybe if you're a country that has a capability to move, some sort of special operations team into a position, what if you get him? What can you extract in return for sending him up to the court, right? Not necessarily the deep state around Putin and Russia, but there might be other people who might we give you Putin, you give us some sort of sanctions relief, or some sort of favorable economic package or what have you. So I don't know. Again, I'm just, it's more out of Hollywood, and you all's kind of laughing at me there, I think.
No, I mean, it's just like, if you gave out any scenario in which Putin travels, he's only going to travel to countries that Russia can plausibly invade in the instance of like him not making it to his flight back. So like I see in the chat, Mr. Albert Lee is describing, like Armenia, which clearly is like a totally different subject, but to the extent of a country that was dealt a bad hand and basically like it didn't get, and that was the high point. In terms of geopolitical position, they're stuck in between Turkey, which wants them erased from the face of the earth, Azerbaijan, which is like actively trying to do that, and Russia, which is upset that that their current leader basically came to power through a color revolution, and Georgia, which is basically returning to its former status as like a very Russia-friendly place. If Armenia's only chance of like getting out of this situation is reliance on Iran, you can sort of see like both the few options they have and sort of why they always intimate that they're willing to like leave CSTO and all that. If like Putin went to Yerevan and the Armenians like tried to hold him, I don't know how much, we could speculate as to exactly how much firepower is left in Russia, but I would guarantee that it would be used to flatten Yerevan without without a second thought.
Yeah, and whatever's left, I'm sure they've got some old 1950s era stuff that they could pull out of the storage if they really wanted to, go along with the T-50 model tanks that are now going to the front as well.
I think they would, at that point, they would dig up Stalin and use that to just like scare everyone, back into their homes.
The ghost of Stalin passed.
Yeah.
Take the bones out.
Lenin's still lying there somewhere too, right? But I digress. So, actually, you've mentioned here briefly, and a couple of the questions here do touch on another subject, and I want to kind of expand on it a little bit. But you mentioned the Collective Security Treaty Organization here, and now, for those in the audience not familiar, well, some of you seem to be because you're asking about it. But that's a military alliance of states. That's Russia and several of its former, Soviet socialist republics. But a lot of those also border onto Chinese territory. So. I don't specifically recall this from the summit, but was there any discussion of how the CSTO potentially has a new relationship under this, unlimited friendship between Russia and China? Was it discussed at all in the summit? If or if not, is it still a factor to be considered, because that's essentially that's additional connective tissue between Russia and China in terms of geography?
One of the things that Russian sinologists point to is that over the course of this conflict and beforehand, China has never canceled any exercise, military exercise with Russia. They've participated in, those big like East military exercises. So from that sort of just straight on the paper reporting, one could say that China has not deviated from any of its support of Russia. So that's essentially like a positive thing. They haven't done more than that, but they haven't done less than that. Once this summit was over, Xi Jinping, sort of like the Chinese government, announced that they were going to have a Central Asia summit, and they invited 4 of the 5 leaders of Central Asia, except for Turkmenistan, which sort of is a bit more isolationist. But that's a clear L, for Putin, in the sense that if Russia conceives of Central Asia as within its sphere of influence and inside of its country, since going back to its conquest starting in like the very beginning of the 19th century, if she feels that, or if he behaves as though he can invite 4 of those leaders literally the week of leaving Moscow, it means that he doesn't think, or he doesn't believe that any sort of negative reaction is going to come out of the Russians. And so part of what we can see, the structural shift in power between the two countries, is that she has a lot more to offer the Central Asians as compared to Russia at this point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't recall any CSTO conversation popping up from what I read and listened to on the meetings, but I think the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, pops up. And that is kind of, it's not the exact same thing as the CSTO, but it is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which for a long time was really dormant, seems to be stepping up in its activities. Maybe it's part of the idea, like the new foreign minister of China, Qin Gang, he was saying, China's going to press the accelerator button on international diplomacy. But the SCO for Central Asia specifically is one of the ways that China is getting after diplomacy through the lens of security for terrorism, separatism, and one of those like seditionism for the area. I think it's interesting that Yuval was mentioning Russia sees China's actions in inviting Central Asia as maybe stepping on its historical boundaries of where it had more influence. And to be clear, Russia is also part of the SCO, but it is one of those things where we see there are competing geopolitical interests between Russia and China, and they both see their own selves being the leaders for the Central Asian states. And there's an active competition between them to gain leadership, more formally for those countries. And I just think it's very interesting. It's something that we'll have to see how it plays out, especially as China and Russia balance their own bilateral relationship. But I know China is looking pretty aggressively in that region. Even Turkmenistan, I think you mentioned they weren't invited. But even then, China's got some deals to build pipelines for natural gas out of Turkmenistan to China. So there are projects that are going on to not only get the diplomacy aspect with the Central Asian states, but also to build physical infrastructure connecting China to those countries. And then obviously layer on top of that the SCO and the security assurances or security arrangements there. And it makes quite a strong argument on the Chinese side, I think, for influence over those countries. But I'd be interested to hear, Yuval, your take more on how that's playing out.
No, so certainly, I mean, I was one speaking with like the Kazakh ambassador to the US, and he said, and this is like years ago when like Russia was really in the ascendancy, sort of like following the annexation of Crimea. So like in that sort of realm, and it was right after the intervention into Syria. So Russia's really like doing well at that point. And he said Kazakhstan cannot have a foreign policy that is orthogonal to our geography, meaning our foreign policy has to be mindful of the fact that Russia is a big country. And now when we look at the big countries in the region, it's obviously like much more so China than it is Russia. So in essence, a country like Kazakhstan, which is relatively like wealthy, especially for the region, what real choices do they have? And the answer is they can limit their interactions with Russia to some extent, but they need to sort of like keep working. But if China is calling, what's really the space for an anti-China foreign policy? And what would be the purpose of an anti-China foreign policy? So for all of these countries, and Turkmenistan, for like a lot of these things, there's somehow always, news reports always say it's unclear whether Turkmenistan was invited. I think for a lot of these things, the invitation to Turkmenistan is open. If they want to be invited, they'll get invited. But since they always say no to everything, why go through the hassle? So in that regard, these countries can obviously look at what's happening right now. And they have, and this is like in all the talks I have with people who study Central Asia, people who come from the region, is that this would be a great time. Like the only people who really want multipolarity, who are not Russia or China, are people in Central Asia. So that as Russia declines, that space is not just taken up all by like just Chinese interests, but there is some space for the United States, for Europe, in order to have the West and Russia and China in one region. So whether that happens is up to basically like US and European diplomacy and sort of diplomatic interest in the region, but certainly the desire of those countries to roll with the times is quite high, because basically there's nothing good coming out of Russia anytime soon.
All right. Thank you, Dan and Yuval again. So we're getting close to about an hour here, and I do want to respect everybody's time and close this out shortly. But I do, one last thing I want to throw out to both of you gentlemen, and then we'll look at wrapping this up, is I think it was concurrent with the time that the summit was happening. There were some sort of cursory reports from, Western U.S. or I think U.S. news outlets that there have been indications that China had shipped or was preparing to a relatively sort of limited volume of what we consider military aid, right? I think there was some looking at small arms and body armor, which is, I've stopped trying to speculate, like what makes a red line and what doesn't. But if you're looking at non-lethal versus lethal military aid, okay, body armor is non-lethal, but small arms rounds, like that's lethal aid, right? Now, is there any indication that that this is going to be in any sufficient quantity to be really meaningful on the battlefield? One, is it any indication of maybe sweetening the pot for something more substantial down the road? Or is it sort of a nothing burger, like it's a blip on the radar that really doesn't have much meaningful impact? And because, again, from the Western U.S. side, the messaging has been pretty clear, like, China, you send any significant military aid that could possibly shift the scales on the battlefield, not going to be good for you. So don't do it.
Let me rephrase this question to Dan, like more specifically. If in the beginning you mentioned, and so Ian was mentioning a moment ago, like personal protective equipment, small arms, resulting ammunition. If we're talking about nothing that has a microchip, just all really sort of somewhere between 1950s to 1980s technology, does China have enough of that for, let's say, 300,000 to 500,000 people that they can give out?
My immediate answer would be no.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean,
So,
I
because
haven't gone around and inspected all of the inventories of the
sure.
PLA army, right? But I know that it was ground centric. It's no longer as much ground centric, but I would think they would want to hold on to everything they could in that regard. I guess they could ship more of that over because they are looking at more high tech weaponry and platforms and actively developing those. But
So again, what we're looking at in terms of how we've observed the Russians fighting in the last few weeks and months is effectively human wave attacks. Does China have the capabilities to give to Russia to make those human wave attacks more lethal? Not that, the Russians would stop dying and, these with eye-watering casualties. That would
right,
continue. But could they basically take out more Ukrainians using that level of
yeah.
those tactics?
So I will rephrase my answer. Yes, probably, right? For the reasons I mentioned, the fact that the Chinese military not long ago, that was the center, that was the focal point of their efforts. And I'm talking like 1980s, right? Or maybe late 70s. It was human wave tactics. And now they are looking for very exquisite things and using the microchips. So they could have stores of that ready to go for Russia. All of that being said, though, my take on the overall situation would be that it wouldn't behoove China to do overt things to support lethal aid to Russia. And I say that because China is very much so trying to skirt the line, in my opinion, of what it provides in aid in a holistic way, so that there's not some sort of Chinese RPG that shows up in Ukraine shot from Russians. That would look really, really bad optically. And you have to keep in mind too that geopolitically, in situations larger than just the bilateral between Russia and China, China's got a lot of vested interest in Eastern Europe and even in many of the strong European Union countries. So if they were to overtly provide serious lethal aid to Russia, then that would cause a lot of fallout between China and the other countries in the region in which it does have serious interests. I think I get what you're getting after, Yuval, in they could supply things like body armor or the components necessary to make body armor, right? They could supply munitions for small arms, probably even munitions for standard rifles that would actually be interoperable with Russian technology. Sure, they could. I do think that even if they are doing that, it's probably going to be limited for the reasons that I said, right? If Chinese equipment starts showing up in the Russian battle space used by Russians at a noticeable level, that would probably cause too much fallout for China to really want to have to deal with when they don't necessarily have to deal with that, right? There is plenty of space for China to sit back and let it keep playing out and let Russia keep attriting its soldiers and its people and weakening its position that is reasonably beneficial for China in a multipolar system, that they would likely continue to do that at the expense of Russia. And that's my opinion on it. But I think that it probably is not so far off of what they're thinking in Shanghai or in Beijing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Yuval and Dan. And I think that the point of identification of stuff on the battlefield, it's got to be a real concern, because these things they have their own fingerprints, right? So I agree. Like if you've got, say, a Chinese, surface to air, shoulder launch missile, that's going to have a very definite configuration and fingerprint, probably to include, the writing on the body of the weapon itself.
Yeah.
And, it's one thing if you're Iran and you're sending your Shahad suicide drones, like Iran's already it's got the crap sanction out of them. So like they get a little hard currency, maybe in exchange, doesn't matter. Cause they've been sanctioned up the wazoo. Whereas to your earlier point, Dan, is like China does not want that because they are so plugged into the global economy. They do not want to risk the impact of sanction over conflict. And I imagine the short-term value of sending advanced weaponry with microchips or even things that have, Chinese writing on it, not worth the economic impact potentially that would go back.
Yeah. And I would even venture to say, I would say most of the aid that China is giving to Russia is not for the dollars, right? It's because they want to make sure that Russia doesn't outright collapse in this war or expend themselves completely fighting the war. The one exception could be in energy. So, China has an actual need for oil. But things like, a few $1 million worth of drones to Russia, if you're sending them from DJI, I mean, there are larger marketplaces around the world with just folks that want personal use drones or whatever, that there's no significant financial benefit for China out of that. It is strictly, in my opinion, again, it's strictly for geopolitics and for making sure that Russia just doesn't outright lose.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Okay. We've gone well past an hour here. So I do want to look at kind of closing things out. So, Dan or Yuval, any final comments or thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap things up?
Love a good crossover event.
It was a lot of fun.
Just like the Avengers, right? We'll have to keep doing some sequels now to keep increasing, ramp up the value of these things. But no, I think it is great that the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, we have access to both of you gentlemen for really the sort of two main areas of concern, of strategic concern for the United States and partners and allies, and that's Russia and China right now. So yeah, great. We'll be able to get you both here. We will look at doing a sequel here at some point in the next few months as opportunity and events develop. But until then, fully expect we'll get you both back on either the Brewcast or the Down the Rabbit Hole in your individual capacities, in continuing our focal points on certain areas here in the coming months. So definitely something to look forward to is here. We don't want to do too many sequels, right? Because then eventually the audience sort of runs out of steam. We want to make them special, so we'll only do this on special occasions. To our audience, thank you as always to your time here, and we do have a pretty busy Brewcast schedule lined up here for the next couple months going into the summer. So make sure you're either checking your email if you're on our email distribution list, or following us on our social media accounts, because it's going to be coming fast and furious. And speaking of another franchise, but anyway, yeah, going into the summer blockbuster season, I guess. So I hope that we here on the Brewcast and the Rabbit Hole sort of meet the same level of energy going forward the next few months. But yeah, definitely follow us. Look for upcoming episodes. And Dan, Yuval, and to our audience, thank you again, and we'll see you all in the next one. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.